to the Politics of Disorder here at the School of Social and Political Science at the University of Lincoln for a wonderful event that I'm very happy to be chairing. I'm Gary Rawnsley, I'm the head of the school, and it's my honour to be introducing my colleagues this evening and also fielding the questions and the answers. I won't be answering anything, I'll be just pointing at you and saying, please, you tell me your question. This is a wonderful event. I'm very proud to be chairing this event. Not only is it showcasing, I think, the wonderful work that is going on in the school, but it also demonstrates the fact that we can put on these kind of events and involve the university and the community and get to showcase outside the university the kind of research that our colleagues are doing. And because it's a very interdisciplinary school, many different approaches, as you'll see tonight, in the kind of works that we are engaged in. Being the chair means that, you know, I don't really have to do very much, but I get to still drink the wine. So I'm very happy always to be in this role. What I'm going to do is I will introduce each speaker individually before they talk. They'll speak for about 12 minutes and about their books, and then we'll take some questions. And then I'll introduce the next speaker, speak for 12 minutes, questions. And then at the end, hopefully we'll have some time for a general discussion between the speakers themselves and of course, any more questions and discussion from the audience. So it gives me a great pleasure to welcome our first speaker tonight, who is an old friend of mine from Nottingham University back in the day when we were both there many years ago, Christian Karna, who is Professor of Sociology here at Lincoln. Prior to this, Christian was Associate Professor of Sociology at Nottingham, and yet earlier, Christian had started his academic career as a Leverhulme postdoctoral research fellow and has held visiting researcher positions at the University of Minnesota, the University of New Orleans, and at Pantheon University in Athens in Greece. Christian has researched and published widely in the areas of nationalism, ethnicity, Central European studies, memory studies, urban sociology, and the sociology of globalization. He's the author of 5 single-authored books, co-editor of 6 edited books, and is also one of 6 Lincoln-based editors of the leading journal Sociological Research Online. So I welcome Christian to talk about his book.
Thank you, Gary, and thanks, Rico, for taking the initiative to get this organized today. So I'm going to try and be really quick, and it's always a challenge to condense ultimately a few years' work into a few sentences. But I do have to go back to what I was working on prior to this book. I've been working on nationalism in Austria for many years, and the book I finished sort of just before starting this one is an attempt to trace the history of nationalisms in Central Europe and in Austria more narrowly over 200 years, which sounds a little ridiculous because obviously that's an enormous undertaking, and it became bigger and bigger. And in the final stages of that work, it became really obvious what I'd suspected for many years, that understanding nationalism really in the here and now, or what's sometimes called neo-nationalism, is ultimately an attempt to try and understand the effects or the perceived effects of globalization on localities. And that brings me to the topic of glocalization. So I finished that previous project, and I thought the next one really has to shorten its historical lens, but perhaps broaden its geographical lens. So I thought, what if someone took stock of how glocalization, the coming together of global influences and local lives, what if someone was to take stock of existing sociological research of that particular topic? And that's essentially what this book became. An attempt to kind of take a cross-section of recent sociological studies and to think about them and to some extent beyond them, and to kind of interrogate how good or not so good sociologists have been at adjusting their methodological and conceptual frameworks to the realities of glocalization. And again, glocalization is different from globalization. It implies that localities matter, and that localities matter because it's there that global flows and influences are experienced and responded to, and sometimes responded to sort of in reactionary and very dismissive or negative ways. So essentially, I think there are three ways of summarizing what the book is trying to do. One is by themes, thematically. One is in terms of the kind of methodological question. What do sociologists do to come to terms with and capture the realities of globalization? And the third one is to interrogate the conceptual adjustments that have been made. So I'll just say a few things about each of these three kind of grids, if you like, that one might apply to what I was trying to do here. So thematically, and that's a retelling pretty much of the chapter structure, I begin by looking at how particular localities are reshaped, reconfigured, affected by global flows. Some of you have heard me talk about this before, so I won't repeat this. I then talk about what I termed the sort of invisible worlds of the economy, and I try and interrogate what sociologists might have to say about things like financial markets, supply chains, and waste. You know, if you sort of think of the different stages in our now global or globally integrated economic systems. I move on to talk about consumerism through things like Greg Martin's work on what he calls the containerization of a consumer economy. The container is what he terms a sort of quintessential global object. And I also sort of review work by, for example, Caroline Knowles, who's pioneered what she calls traveling methods. And she kind of argues ultimately we need to follow some of the commodities of our global economies to understand really the back roads and the front roads of globalization in that sense. That brings me on to migration, and my discussion of migration ends up being less about the global flow of people and much more about the blockages that, you know, for example, asylum seekers stuck in reception centers, very topical, of course, at the moment, experience. So the idea that somehow globalization is all about the global and unrestricted flow of various things comes in for some serious criticism if we understand that globalization might result in blockages as much as in flows. I then move on to urban sociology, and I try and sort of argue that there's a need for some methodological adjustments to try and understand the global and the local coming together in particular local settings. I then talk about things like street art and the politics of street art, and I make a case for some methodological adjustments there, and I'll say a bit more about that. And then I think I say some perhaps rather typical of me things about technology and the kind of digital revolution and its social consequences in the here and now. So the methodological grid for all of this might be to say, I kind of try and build on various interventions that have shaped sociology over the last 20 years, or what I think have been some of the most important interventions. The argument that somehow sociology needs to adjust to local and global realities is not new. So John Urry was arguing 2 decades ago that actually sociology was now confronted with a world beyond society. If we think about that, that's quite remarkable. You know, what does a sociology beyond or outside society actually look like? And in the period since then, some really interesting arguments have been made. So, for example, Les Back makes a case for the art of listening, also in the context of globalization. How do we hear global flows? Other people, someone by the name of Alex Rhys-Taylor, extends that, and he argues that actually we need to develop a kind of art of smelling. There's a way of kind of tapping into all our perceptual skills and the full sort of array of human perception in order to capture the global and the local. Then there's the aforementioned Caroline Knowles and the stuff about traveling methods. And I add to that by kind of making a case for looking for new vantage points. My argument is that ultimately, to understand globalization, we probably need to find places that haven't been researched and that are hard to find. It's not easy to find where exactly global flows touch down in particular localities, let alone how and where local people respond to them. Then I think there's a really weird methodological case I make. I'm addicted to my running. For anyone who doesn't yet know, I was telling Henry today I can't go more than 2 days without running, without developing serious sort of, you know, all the musculoskeletal illnesses that we develop as academics. And my antidote is running. And in the course of researching this, it just really, I was running through my childhood neighborhood, and it occurred to me that actually that was probably the most effective ethnographic tool that I'd ever really stumbled across. You know, what happens when you go back to where you grew up and you know that place really, really well, and you record in a way in which you can't if you walk. You kind of record social change over the last 25, 30 years. And you know, it sounds weird, I know, I'm happy to elaborate, but I think there's something here about, you know, sort of fine-tuning our ethnographic methods and our ethnographic imagination. And then there's what I call a sort of a reading of palimpsests in urban settings. I mentioned street art, so I try and kind of read how street art in one particular place, this happens to be in Vienna, is kind of a local commentary on global events. And I go there every 3 months or so, and it's just amazing how this urban palimpsest keeps changing. It's like a running commentary on global events that refracted through local concerns. Conceptually, so this was my second grid. Have I got 2 minutes?
You've got 5 minutes.
Oh, right, okay, I can slow down. I can slow it down a little bit. So conceptually, to span a conceptual grid over all of this, in the same way in which methodologically sociologists have, I think, quite successfully recalibrated what they do in these times of globalization, there's some really interesting conceptual revivals or conceptual innovations that are worth taking note of. And again, I quote Les Back, who I think comes up with the most wonderful phrase when he asks us to ponder whether people actually are experts in their own lives. Now, if you think about it, the qualitative tradition in the social sciences kind of has to presuppose that we ask questions and people answer them, right? Or that people, ordinary people, know the answers to our questions in some shape or form. And Les Back, I think in a really ingenious way, doesn't allow us to just take that as fact. And I think I take that one step further by saying, actually, I think that assumption is in serious need of revision. I mean, I doubt very much that historians necessarily assume historical actors to have been experts in their social realities, right? That's the kind of historian's craft to some extent. The documents go up to a point, but then analysis kicks in. And I think there's a real need for what we know as the double hermeneutic to be rethought in a world that is so complex that none of us understand it, quite frankly. So the idea that somehow we ask questions of ordinary people and they tell us answers to our questions, I think in times of globalization really requires re-debate or rediscussion. Then there's some kind of engagement with Manuel Castell's notion of a mode of development. The book to some extent responds negatively, I think, to the idea that somehow globalization is all about neoliberalism. All we need to do is understand global capital and the wave of neoliberalism, so the argument often goes, and we've cracked it. And I'm trying to argue against that and say, by pointing out that globalization is a lot more than that. It can take neoliberal forms, but it doesn't necessarily do that at all. And there are various things that are far older than neoliberalism that also fall under the rubric of global flows. And Castell's notion of a mode of development, I think, is a really, really useful conceptual anchor in that respect. I talk about Merton's idea of the unintended consequences of social action. I think that's a conceptual mode that is in urgent need of being revived. If we think about the unintended consequences of our smartphones, rare earth extraction, right? How many of us know where that stuff comes from, let alone what it does to the world or to its places of extraction? To me, the most amazing bit of social science over the last 10 years traces the consequences of rare earth extraction, and it's full of accounts of the unintended consequences of our digital lives. And ultimately, I think I make a case for a kind of Socratic approach, or a rediscovery and the celebration of sociologists and social scientists being really modest but critical in all directions as they engage with the hallmarks of our times of globalization. I haven't gone into any of the kind of thematic details. I think it's probably better to do that in response to questions. So that was kind of just a thematic overview, a sort of a sense of what the methodological arguments are and what the conceptual interventions aim to do. Thank you. I'll leave it at that.
Thank you very much.
So we've got a little bit of time. If anybody wants to ask any questions to Christian, please do. Mingye, yes.
Okay. So can you elaborate on how sociology is going to help us understand society beyond the society?
Right. I think if globalization is about what Paderai once called the sort of flows and scapes of global interconnectedness, so his argument is people flow across boundaries, capital, finance, obviously, technology, ideas. And what's the last one? People, finance, technology, ideologies. So those 5 things he argued back in the early 1990s routinely cross national borders, and they create these transnational scapes within which we live. Then I think that the methodological question is really important. How do we capture any of these flows? And I think the answer is partly by following whatever flows transnationally, but partly also to be really alert to what happens when, again, a locality is intersected by the transnational flow of people, of finance, of commodities, of ideas, of media images, of anything else, of waste. You know, I mean, so many other things need to be added to this list of flows, and I think it's a sort of balancing act of being flexible and moving with these things, but at the same time being really conscious of again the local intersection of influences from elsewhere and you know, intersections that more often than not sort of respond in multiple and contradictory ways to outside influences. And we know that from migration. We know that migratory flows notoriously polarize local populations, right? We see that all the time over the issue of asylum. Brexit was nothing other than that, you know, a kind of polarization of a population over global flows, particularly migration. And I think that case can be made about sort of just about any global flow. I'm not sure if that answers the question. It's about methodological flexibility and innovation, and also, as I said, a sort of rethinking and recycling of some well-established concepts.
Okay, yeah.
Just out of interest, how long have you been working on football?
That's hard to say because it kind of connects with lots of older projects. I mean, how long was I wrote this during the pandemic, essentially. So you know, this is my therapy for, you know. this is lockdown, and I'm really grateful. This would have taken a lot longer, but you know, it's very much the outgrowth of various much older projects. Yeah.
So if we want a good ref result, we need more lockdowns. So, Mark.
Yeah, thanks, Christian. Yeah, really interesting stuff. I'm really intrigued by you're using street art, as you're saying, and wonder whether you might develop that a little bit. Did you find returning to sort of looking at kind of local street art tells you something about the development of place and the relationship between the sort of, you know, the globalized notion and how that plays out on a local environment?
Yeah, absolutely. It's a little bit like this particular place. It's a little bit like getting a sense of how largely people on the political left, but not exclusively, read and respond to current affairs, both local and global. I mean, it's really quite amazing. As I said, I'm there on average every 3 or 4 months, and it's like reading a newspaper, you know, over that longer stretch of time, written from a very particular ideological vantage point. And obviously it comes with all the artistic elaborations that, you know, graffiti offers. This particular place has become a sort of tourist attraction, right? And actually, one of the things I did is I was sort of looking back at sort of archival material. What do we know about when this stuff started? And it really did start in the, you know, shortly after the turn of the millennium. You go back to the 90s, and this was just a sort of bare, boring urban space. And now it's just this constantly shifting canvas for graffiti artists. But the very first bit of graffiti I discovered was from the early 1950s. It was a singular graffiti, and it was a statement against or about the Korean War, very much critical of the years. Then there was nothing in terms of graffiti, street art, on a very long stretch of, I mean, this is a canal cutting across Vienna, and now, as I said, it's become this sort of mixture of everyday artistic expression and political statements that get made.
Okay, maybe just one more question before we move.
Okay, thank you for your presentation. I have a clarifying question. Is your book more about discussing theories, or do you present some case studies in the book? You mentioned Korea, Austria, your childhood.
It tries to be a bit of everything. So I guess it works on these three layers. I try and review what recent sociology has done. Secondly, it's these themes of localities, the economy, consumerism, migration, street art, or urban sociology and technology. And then it's the kind of conceptual theoretical debate. You know, what do we need to do with a notion like the double hermeneutic? You know, what does that mean in the 21st century? Or what are unintended consequences of social action? Well, why do we need that idea? And is it different from, you know, what Robert Merton in that case had in mind back in the 1930s? So it's kind of three-layered.
So don't worry, if you haven't had a chance to interrogate Christian yet and you want to do so, there'll be an opportunity at the end. We're going to have a lot of time left for you to question all of our speakers. But in the meantime, thank you, Christian.
Thank you very much.
Okay, so our next speaker is Rico Isaacs, Professor of International Politics at the University of Lincoln. His research interests lay at the intersection of authoritarianism, nationalism, and populism, with a specific focus on the post-communist space, especially Central Asia. He's published in many academic journals and is currently the serving editor for Central Asian Survey, the premier journal in the world for Central Asian Studies. He's also the director of the Politics of Disorder Research Group. Political Opposition in Authoritarianism, which I will change the slide, is Professor Isaacs' 8th book and was published last year with Palgrave Macmillian. It's the culmination of nearly 20 years of thinking and writing about the nature of political opposition and authoritarianism in Central Asia, and specifically the case of Kazakhstan. Its findings are based on 14 years of in-field research, speaking with over 100 political actors in the Kazakh system, including many high-profile opposition elites. I don't want to say too much more about the book, because I'm hoping you're going to do that. So please, let's give a welcome to Rico.
Thanks, Gary. So the introduction was written specifically at the end to lead me into where I start talking about political elites in Kazakhstan. So this book actually has its genesis to some extent about 10 years ago when one of the opposition leaders in Kazakhstan, a guy called Bolas Abilov, quit politics. He basically had enough. He said, I'm going into the movie business. I'm done with this opposition lark in Kazakhstan. Kazakhstan's a very authoritarian state, and he wasn't getting anywhere. And I was struck at the time reading this interview. I was like, oh, okay, well, that's, you know, having some years before spent a lot of time interviewing opposition elites in Kazakhstan and going around to party offices, and they were very, very vibrant. And then a year or so before he gave that interview, going around to those offices and they're dead. And just thinking, okay, so what explains this sort of decline of opposition? And then some years later, what happens is that actually we start to see more kind of grassroots protests emerge in Kazakhstan in 2011, 2016, 2019, and 2022. And so I was struck that there's a story here to tell about the nature of political opposition in Kazakhstan, how it's kind of how it emerges from oligarchic opposition, which is what Bolas Abilov represented, to this kind of grassroots opposition. And that's the story I wanted to tell in the book. But at the same time, I'm trying to, as with any good piece of academic work, hopefully, make some kind of theoretical or conceptual contribution. And what I was interested in, particularly in relation to the broader literature on authoritarianism and the nature of political opposition in authoritarianism, was thinking about opposition agency. So to some extent, on the surface, thinking about poor old Bolas Abilov, and so, he's wanting to go into the movie business. How does opposition agency influence or shape regime dynamics in authoritarian systems? Do they have any influence at all, or do they simply fade away? And actually, that's quite important in the title, because the book is about political opposition in authoritarianism and not under authoritarianism. Much of the work in authoritarianism tends to focus on how political regimes seek to place sanctions and co-opt political opposition. And it's on the agency of the regime, the power of autocratic leaders. And to some extent, that makes sense. But actually, how do opposition operate in such context? How can they develop or display any form of agency? So that's primarily what the book is about, thinking about the nature of political opposition agency in Kazakhstan over a kind of 30-year period. And to do that, to conceptualize and think about the nature of opposition agency, I draw on the work of the great, Nick's nodding already, he knows who I'm going to say, Albert Hirschman, this sort of great political economist, And his, his kind of very elegant dichotomy of exit and voice. And so I conceptualize opposition agency in the case of Kazakhstan in relation to Hirschman's idea of exit and voice. And for Hirschman, basically he conceived of this concept of exit and voice and loyalty. Actually, there's a third element, but I'll skip over that for now, for time's sake. But exit and voice for Hirschman was in relation to thinking about customers' responses to declining businesses. So, either you can either exit and go to another business, get a better product, or you can demonstrate some kind of voice. And to some extent, you can see that in relation to politics. You can see that in relation to opposition politics in authoritarian regimes. Hirschman himself actually used it to write and think about opposition in the GDR, for example, and particularly in relation to migration. What I kind of conceptualize in the book around opposition and agency and exit and voice is that in the case of Kazakhstan, what we see over this sort of period of 20, 30 years is opposition agency emerge through exit from the regime. So we find political elites who were once kind of close to Nazarbayev, is the president of Kazakhstan. He's not dead yet, actually, but he will be soon. He is... he's about 85. Opposition agency exit. Political elites exit from the regime, they establish opposition parties, and this actually acts as a signal to the regime in the case of Kazakhstan. A feedback signal to say, oh, hold on, we need to recalibrate. And there's a response from the regime, notably in terms of sanctions, in that they'll seek to place particular sanctions on political elites or sanctions on the political parties that political elites create, or they'll undertake a form of institutional adaptation, which is they'll try to change the architecture of the state, change the constitution, change the law on political parties, which kind of makes it harder for the opposition to display voice in this case. So, but what tends to happen is that over time, the more sanctions that are placed on the opposition, the more institutional adaptation that takes place, that space for kind of institutional opposition, oligarchic opposition closes down. That leads to Abilov in 2013 going, okay, I've had enough, there's no chance for me here. But then what emerges is the fact that the regime, so there is no space then, without any kind of form of institutional opposition, oligarchic opposition, there's no space for opposition to emerge. So where does it emerge? Well, it emerges through grassroots protests. And this is what we start to see in Kazakhstan from about 2011 onwards. How much time have I got?
You've got 6 minutes.
Okay, good. So I'll do the empirical stuff now. So this is what happens in Kazakhstan from about 2011 onwards. In the 1990s, attempts at parliamentary opposition in Kazakhstan are basically closed down through changes to the constitution, marginalising opposition in parliament. That shifts then to oligarchic opposition who emerged, and I've already mentioned people like Abilov, and they are then closed down as a consequence of their forms of exit and voice and opposition agency. Once Abilov's gone, and actually it's clear that these types of political parties, institutional oligarchic forms of opposition are gone, what's left to emerge is this grassroots opposition. So in 2011, there's some violence in Zhanaozen, which is in the west of the country, the oil-producing region in Kazakhstan. We're striking workers. They've been out on strike for about 6 months as a consequence, striking workers. Is also difficult for them in that it's not like with oligarchic opposition, you can hammer a particular member of the political elite, you can put them through the rigmarole of kind of, tax police. So how they respond is really scattergun. So they blame different groups. They blame actually a group of Kazakhs called Ural men who are returnees who had fled during the Stalinist periods in Kazakhstan to Mongolia and come back. So they got blamed. Actually, the president's son-in-law also got blamed, and he was sacked as the head of the Sovereign Wealth Fund. And they also blamed an opposition leader of a banned political party who wasn't even there at the time, and he was put in prison as well for 7 years. We also see protests in 2016 emerge, again, out of nowhere for the regime, because that feedback signal's gone from institutional and oligarchic opposition. The regime doesn't know where this is coming from. So in 2016, there's land protests over fears that the government is going to basically sell off land to the Chinese, that spread across the country. In 2019, there are election protests in Kazakhstan. This is driven actually by hipster youth, I'd call them. Nazarbayev had resigned and had basically given over power to his chosen successor. And the first thing the chosen successor does is change the name of the capital to Nur Sultan, the first name of the previous president of Nazarbayev. And the youth of Kazakhstan are kind of just shocked. Like, they've had 30 years of this Nazarbayev guy. He's gone, and they think that's great. And the next day, oh, it's evident he's still there. So you get all these kind of election protests. And interestingly, I mean, in relation to sort of connecting with Christian's presentation, a lot of this is arts-based in many ways. One of the most prominent forms of protest was a banner that was unfurled at the Almaty Marathon, where all the protagonists were arrested afterwards, which said, "You can't run from the truth." And we want fair elections. And then, again, my point being that this grassroots opposition comes out of nowhere as a consequence of the closing down of that feedback signal from previous opposition agencies. And then in 2022, just last year, that many of you may be aware of because it was quite high profile in the news, there was violence across Kazakhstan that had spread initially because of a hike in gas prices, but it spoke to much kind of wider socio-economic concerns, and also it was also about Nazarbayev and actually the Nazarbayev regime, even though he'd left office. The big chant of the protests was Shavkat, which in Kazakh means old man out, and you saw statues torn down of Nazarbayev. The point of all this in the book is that it's essentially telling the story of how opposition agency can shape the dynamics of authoritarian regimes. It demonstrates how, on the surface, Kazakhstan was always seen as the stable country or the stable authoritarian regime in Central Asia, but actually underneath, as a consequence of this sort of opposition agency, there's a great deal of instability. So I'll leave it there. I think that should be my time up. So thanks so much.
Yeah, thank you very much, Rico. Okay, so questions, comments, please. Yes.
Really enjoyed that, Rico. Can I ask a little bit about the voice element?
Yeah.
And the question is around, from your talk, it's multivocal, the opposition.
Yeah.
Hipster youth. It's not going to shine with many people in a traditional society, for example.
Yeah.
I was going to say, is that the case? You're nodding, so clearly,
yeah.
I guess it is. But is that a problem? Is there a univocal message that comes out across all this, or is it lots of disparate voices?
So you've hit the nail on the head. I mean, I didn't really talk about it, but the nature of opposition, particularly this grassroots opposition, is very heterogeneous. So in particular in relation to the violence that took place, or the protests that took place last year, you've got different groups going on. You have your hipsters, okay, they're coming out of their coffee shops and putting their Macs away. But actually you've got the kind of the more rural population, the so-called more conservative nationalist rural population. You've also got this divide in between Kazakh speakers, so Kazakh speakers, and then you've got Russian Kazakh speakers. And that's actually a big divide as well. So the hipsters, again, going to questions of glocalization, actually to some extent, are seen as the cosmopolitan anywheres. They've been educated in, usually, they've had education abroad, and whereas the sort of the more rural elements of the opposition tend to be, Kazakh local educated as well. So, and there is a divide about them. And actually, I did some pieces specifically about the hipster opposition that I've written about separately, and they're aware of this kind of disconnect that they have, that actually their voice doesn't reach or speak to the same issues as those of the more rural conservative population, who are concerned about land in particular, and sort of traditional family values and nationalism. Whereas the hipsters are more interested in all that kind of liberal stuff, you know, human rights, coffee, human rights, and those kind of things. Yeah, so it's very multivocal in that sense. I mean, and to some extent, in the sort of conceptual framework in the book, I suppose one of my contributions is to disaggregate the exit voice loyalty framework, to say actually there's different forms of exit, and there's different forms of exit with voice, without voice, and it occurs in kind of different spheres.
Okay, we have a question from Desiree.
What did exit do to the regime? Don't they want that? Because it releases some pressure valve. And so if that's the case, then there wouldn't have been any kind of reason for more repression or anything, right? Because the opposition exits, so there's less opposition. And similarly, how constraining or how effective is the new grassroots opposition, do you think? Or is it just like it's not as effective as the previous kind of opposition, in which case maybe eventually we'll see an exit as well in this grassroots thing that fizzle out?
Yeah, thanks. Two good questions. So going back to my sort of previous point about how I framed it, there are different forms of exit. So there's exit from the regime itself, right? That's problematic for the regime because all of a sudden you've got insiders going public and saying things they shouldn't about corruption in particular. And that threatens the regime. So on the one hand, they want to close that down as quickly as possible, which they seek to do through forms of sanction or institutional adaptation. Then when things get too much for that opposition, they also then have the choice of actually exiting the political system altogether, which is, you know, I started with Bolat Abilov, and that's what he did. Others flee the country and they live in exile, and they seek to, you know, still have voice and criticize the regime, and to some extent sponsor opposition from abroad. So Mukhtar Ablyazov is one very famous guy. He's a former banker, energy minister. He's wanted in court in the UK, for example, for embezzlement. He's somewhere in France, I believe, hiding. So there's different forms of exit. And your second point, which was,
Do you think it's more or less effective?
Well, actually, it's a really good question. It's hard to. Actually, it's more effective in the sense that it's uncontrollable and it's unknowable. I think that's the problem for the regime. It's spontaneous. Often it's spontaneous, or it's organised through social media quite quickly and rapidly, and they don't know how to kind of contain it or nail it down. And then you might do initially by kind of oppression, by putting police on the street, security service on the street, but it pops up again. It's like that game whack-a-mole a little bit. So it's effective in that extent, and I think what's happening in Kazakhstan at the moment, there's a lot more discourse coming from the Tokayev regime, the new president, about reform. And so there is a drive towards more reform and seem to respond to the grassroots opposition. Talking about listening, one of the big things of the Tokayev regime is that it's a listening state now. In what way? But as one informant said to me, yeah, but they're not hearing. So that's the other issue.
Okay, maybe one more. Yeah.
Can you elaborate a little bit more about the concepts of loyalty?
So the loyalty it comes into Hirschman uses as a kind of equation filler to some extent in trying to explain, well, why do some people stay with companies or businesses when they're not very, when you've got kind of diminishing returns in relation to them. And so in relation to this, actually where loyalty does appear is where you get sort of examples of co-optation. So some opposition elites are kind of tempted back into the regime with some jobs, some small jobs or kind of trinkets. So that's kind of how it feeds into the exit voice.
But can you also loyalty to change the political regime, like from inside?
Well, so actually interesting. I mean, so I think in the first stage that I discuss in the book is what I call is like voice inside the regime. So these instances where, high-profile political elites, whether former prime ministers or other public figures, They approach the president about their concerns, whether it's some of it's to do with kind of declining democratic standards. Most of it's actually to do with the extent to which the president is selling off former state-owned assets to his son-in-law, right? Which they're a bit miffed about because they're not getting access to these oil companies, gas companies. So to some extent, that's the first initial kind of loyal option within the regime. Like, actually, I'm not going to go public, but I'm going to go and talk to the president about it. But the problem is, authoritarian leaders are not often very reasonable about these sorts of things, and you know, nothing changed. So that's when they shift to this kind of exit the regime with voice, with their kind of criticisms of the president.
Okay, thank you. So please, please, again, you know, if you think of any questions or comments you want to give to Rico, we'll have plenty of time at the end to do that. And I'll remember to change the slide before our next. There we go. So, ladies and gentlemen, we offer you tonight not one book, not two books, but 3 books here at the University of Lincoln. You don't get that at many other universities. And I'm pleased to report that our last speaker of the evening is Mike Slaven. Mike, thank you. Yes, the fan club's in, Mike. Okay, good. Mike is a senior lecturer in international politics. He researches migration governance in both the USA and Europe, often focusing on irregular migration and the treatment of immigration as a security issue. Securing Borders, Securing Power, The Rise and Decline of Arizona's Border Politics was published in August of last year by Columbia University Press and is Mike's first book. And yeah, congratulations, Mike. An earlier version of this research won a prize for outstanding doctoral thesis at the University of Edinburgh. Mike draws on his experience working in politics in Washington, D.C. and in the state of Arizona to provide a detailed insider account of how populist border security politics consumed Arizona's state politics from 2004 to 2010, foreshadowing the rise of Donald Trump. We whisper his name in case anything comes crashing down, and placing Arizona at the center of American political controversy. But by tying together the fields of security studies, migration politics, populism, and US politics, Mike also draws out the surprising lessons that Arizona holds for how this increasingly common style of politics may be effectively combated. Ladies and gentlemen, Mike Slaven.
Thanks. I feel like I don't really need to present the book after.
You wrote it.
That's the thing. I was going to say, yeah, I'll show you all these things that I gave Gary to say. But thank you. And thanks to Rico for putting this together. So I think I beat both Christian and Rico on the question of how long have you been working on this sort of thing. So when I was back in Phoenix talking about this book, I said, well, I mean, so my background is after I graduated from university, I went to go work for the governor of Arizona, and that was in 2007, which sounds shockingly long ago now. But even before then, I had interned in Arizona politics before, and back in 2004, when this issue was really starting to rise up to the top of the political agenda in Arizona, I was thinking, this is going to be interesting and difficult. And so it's really then that I started to think about work in this area. And that was literally half of my lifetime ago. So this is there's like 300 pages about about all of that. So I've been working in and around these topics for a long time. Now, one of the things I've been thinking about before tonight was, why should you all care about some place as obscure as Arizona? I hadn't fully appreciated I'd be following a presentation about Kazakhstan, so which, as far as the English-speaking world goes, is arguably even more obscure. But one of the reasons is, as I told Gary to say, there is a sense in which Arizona's been put at the forefront of national political controversy in the U.S. It was the second closest state in the 2020 presidential election, for example, which wouldn't have happened for various reasons I'll sketch out, wouldn't have happened 20 years ago, but is the case now because of how this politics has transformed the state. But also because the issue trajectory of migration is that is visible in Arizona, arguably before the rest of the United States, is so familiar. So the book is really about how this framing or this discussion of immigration as a security issue becomes increasingly intense, right, and starts to really dominate the political landscape. So, you know, this kind of inexorable march toward more extreme security-based measures that we're seeing, for instance, with the illegal immigration bill, as it's called, in the UK. I mean, the type of thing that you say, well, what are they going to come up with next, right? This is that issue trajectory. But what also happened in Arizona is that after this had built up for many years, this fell apart in ways that really surprised everybody based on what had already gone on. So there are lessons to be drawn out from this. So in addition to that issue trajectory, right, which we should be able to generally see commonalities with a lot of places in the world. And so I try to connect what happened in this corner in the US-Mexico borderlands to these larger discussions of what's going on in a lot of Europe, in Australia, for example. You have this, this phenomenon where people who are proposing ways to address this issue who were not regarded as being serious, right, or were not taken seriously, increasingly started driving it, right? Another kind of familiar thing. So as part of this book, I interviewed Kirsten Sinema, who's a U.S. senator now, who's well known for being quite idiosyncratic, right? But she was in the legislature at the time that I'm writing about this. So, and you know, talking to her, the total consensus view, the people who are pushing this hardline border security stuff at first were not taken seriously. They were dismissed because they would not get anywhere with this, right? Now we all know they got somewhere with this, right? We all know on a national US level, they went somewhere. In plenty of European countries, they have gotten somewhere. This has proven to be a very effective campaigning tactic by which has mainstreamed both far-right views on immigration and has helped to mainstream the far-right in general. So how does this happen, right? Despite, so tying together these observations about the increasing political power of the far-right based on immigration and also the issue trajectory of immigration overall, the really surprising thing is that, as these processes unfold, there are plenty of people in the political system who do not really agree with this or have strong opinions or really think that this is a good idea. But nonetheless, it happens anyway. In the US political system, you have so many veto points where policies can be shut down if someone disagrees with them or doesn't want to let it go through. So how did this keep on going through in Arizona and get to that point? So I'm not going to talk too much about the empirics or anything other than to say that I would interview people and they'd say, I really don't know, actually, in the end, why this happened. And to get to Christian's point, are people experts on their own lives, right, or their own experiences? Actually, what they would tell me is we don't really know why this all happened in retrospect. And so then we get to the point where academics come in and we can perhaps shed light on that. So I'm just going to focus on a couple of things to take away that you might take away if you lack intrinsic interest in Arizona, which I would forgive you for, sort of. One of the things I sketch out in the book is talking about the relationship between security and populism and why both of these are quite important in their interaction with each other to driving this kind of agenda dominance that eventually develops around immigration. So there's this thinking in the security studies field that security is a realm that's really controlled by the existing elites, right? The top hierarchy of the state. Then you have the classified information. They are the people who are looked to with authority on this. They're the decision makers. And so they dominate how security is understood socially. So the nagging question, of course, is when you think about treating immigration as a security issue, how is it that all these marginal political actors break through, right, and are able to kind of seize back some mantle of authority from the people who are supposed to be in charge of the problem? And the link between populism and security is especially important here because there's both commonalities in the way that these ideas work, right? They focus on the community around some kind of definition of community, around some kind of danger. They focus on an idea of kind of a more authentic representation of the community and protection. On the autonomy of the community as something that's being compromised, so they can no longer direct their own future unless this threat is combated in some way. But of course, the twist that's not really appreciated in security studies is that the right-wing populists portray the elites as part of the problem rather than as the authority to enact the solution. And this interaction between these things, I argue, has a very important effect on how the existing governing elites respond to this. Because if it's a security issue, it's important inherently, it's urgent, but there's no particular reason to believe the outsiders rather than the insiders on what they say. But when you add in the kind of the anti-elitism of populism and the twisting around of who's responsible and who's ultimately the problem, you start to get a much more panicked response among the governing elites once this starts to get traction in the media. And so that's when you start to see this pattern of ground being given rather than refusing to entertain, as many tried to do at first. These people are not serious. We're not going to listen to them. We're not going to give in to what they say. Very quickly that tune changed in Arizona, and as has happened in a lot of places. This the second point I want to draw out for people is the competitive dynamics that then emerge around securing borders, right? So my fundamental observation is that when we're talking about securing borders, this is not really about securing the state or society. This is about politicians competing with each other for power. The only people in the system who ideologically were predisposed to this kind of very border security heavy treatment of the issue was the far right. Nobody else really thought it was that important inherently, but everybody started to, sing this tune. The competitive dynamics that emerge are asymmetrical. So this is a very important issue to the people who are very against it. It's not as important an issue to the people who have more moderate views, right? And this is true in public opinion research. It's also true among the political elites I talk to. And this creates a dynamic where it's acceptable for the more moderate actors in the system to continually give ground on it as the price of maintaining power to pursue other priorities. So a lot of this has to do with the interaction between security and non-security items on the political agenda, which is another quite blind spot in security studies, which assumes that if there is a security issue, it rises to the top and is dealt with in an isolated and authoritative way. But in reality, this is a much bigger part of the wider political give and take and larger political struggles that are going on. For instance, in Arizona, racial politics, right, about inclusion and exclusion in society. Or, sometimes you'd see a border security bill signed so you could get like an all-day kindergarten bill passed, right? This kind of horse trading that happens in politics, these issues cannot be isolated from each other. They're done together. And but these linkages create these continual opportunities for the border security side to force its views. And the third thing that I really like to emphasize, though, is that there is a possibility for change, right? As inexorable as this politics seems, what happened in Arizona is that it reached a climax in about 2010 with some very hardline legislation that got a lot of national and international attention. The Republicans who were pushing that did great in the elections that autumn. The individuals who were responsible for it got more formal power than ever before, and the next year it was over. There was a reaction against this within the Republican Party by the more kind of business-aligned wing of the party that basically said, this has caused so much heat and consternation. We don't really think that the law was as bad as everyone says, but we're just not going to go along with this sort of thing anymore. We want to talk about taxes, right? And it worked. And it was in part because they wouldn't have done that unless there had been a lot of activism and a lot of drawing attention to the issue by people who were fundamentally opposed to what was happening. But it all shows that, if my original question is why is immigration treated as a security issue when it's such a complex issue with so many different sides, and when there is such contestation around it, what explains this dominant issue trajectory? Then what Arizona does show is that this can change and be rebalanced, and the implications have been profound. So Arizona has gone from a state that was relatively reliably conservative to one where there is much more partisan parity in electoral competition. And a lot of this is because of sort of a drift of some white professionals away from the party, from the Republican Party and toward the Democrats that's visible as early as 2011. In which I discussed. So it's not as if there is now a placid political situation in Arizona. Actually, it's just as nuts as it's always been in many ways. But the position of the issue on the agenda is different. People still talk about it. It's still an important issue, but it no longer is a dominant issue. So I'll leave it there, right, as to why you should care about my little corner of the world, which is somewhat more notable than Kazakhstan. Sorry.
Okay. Okay. Questions? Yes, Simon.
Maybe I'm desperately trying to cling on to hope. But you talk about decline and a shift in the partisan and the electoral politics of immigration as a securitized issue. And I come from Australia, where we've seen kind of a similar shift from a very strong bordering level government to a now a Labour government. We may be seeing a similar political realignment here in the UK. My question is, are we seeing this as a decline in electoral salience, but after the Overton window, after the window of what's acceptable to talk about, after all the batshit crazy laws have been put in place, and are still there well after, the Labour government in Australia hasn't changed, offshore processing.
Right.
A Labour government here may not, wind back Rwanda. Is there hope, or is this just kind of, we've got some new people administering some already terrible policies?
Well, the question of what would the Labour government in Australia or the potential Labour government here do, right? And is it really that different? Is part of the larger trajectory that I'm talking about, right? And it's not a fight worth having if we want to do something else, right? And so that is that dynamic. What has happened in Arizona and in wider U.S. politics is, to some extent, this is electoral sorting, right? So it's the fact that more anti-immigration people have tended to move into the Republican Party and vice versa. So you get the parties have increasingly different views in their voting bases on the issue. But in Arizona, at least, there are dynamics that actually suggest that there is a change, right? So the Republicans, many Republicans have become much more hesitant to be really envelope pushing on this. So, for instance, what are the states that are doing really envelope pushing things on immigration right now? It's mainly Texas, Greg Abbott, and then Ron DeSantis in Florida. The guy who just finished 8 years as the Republican governor of Arizona was obviously much more hesitant about doing that kind of thing and getting out there in that way, right? And that is as a result of this experience. And then the Democrats as well are less willing to compromise on a lot of things. And it has changed the position of the issue within the party, right? So is it reduced salience? Perhaps to a degree, but actually within the Democratic Party, it's now more of a core issue that they're less willing to compromise on, whereas before it could be it was disposable, right? Because it wasn't part of their social vision or their program for governing. It was just an issue you had to get out of the way. But that's changed, right? And that has changed arguably because it has become a higher salience issue that more people care about. And so, my argument is that there actually are changes to how both parties in Arizona deal with the issue.
Okay, yes, okay.
Isn't it the case that if you poll people, I'm not familiar with polling data, but if you poll people at various points going back probably to 1965, they don't want huge numbers. The average American, well, it depends on your frequent question, but there wasn't a huge amount of support probably for large-scale immigration. Similarly, if you did a plebiscite on the death penalty in the 1960s in the UK, it was popularly supported, but elite politicians got rid of it. Similarly, so there was a political consensus among political elites to be relatively pro-immigration, amongst Democrats and Republicans in the 80s and 90s with Reagan and Clinton. But there was always probably a lot of popular support for, quote-unquote, securing our borders, even if that language wasn't yet commonplace.
Yeah.
So then it's unsurprising that, at a certain point, there's enough room in the political marketplace for actors to enter and capitalize on the fact that it's a fairly salient issue with broad popular support. Similarly in the UK, there's broad popular support for getting the numbers of migrants down. So that's what I thought was kind of in the background of what you're saying, you weren't necessarily touching on. And then perhaps I'm seeing this as an economist, but then, so this broad popular support in my view, maybe not majority support, but there's a significant portion of people across Western countries who want less immigration. But there's also an economic cost, and people might not be aware fully of those economic costs. So then the pushback against stronger border protection might come only when those economic costs are dealt. So in the UK case, things like, you know, fruit prices going up because there are not enough people to pick the fruit, or something, or you know, universities doing badly because they can't get international students. So that was kind of what was going on in my head, I guess, complementing your story of the political negotiations.
What I would, so first of all, the presumption that most people want less immigration, right, which is, and it very much does depend on how you ask the question, and there's been some UK polling recently which has shown this. If you ask the question one way, people say one thing. If you ask it the other way, they say the other. But the presumption, and this is the dominating presumption of a lot of the work on immigration politics, but it's increasingly less true, right? And that you see much more evidence in polls that that there's a more noticeable amount of people who support current levels of migration or want it to go up. The second thing that I point out is that you can want less immigration for all sorts of reasons, right? But to treat immigrants as a threat is a distinct mode of politics. You can say that, well, you know, immigration isn't good for the economy, right? But the security, but that's restriction, right? And that security brings in a certain set of meanings that are not necessarily identical to the restricted ones. Then the other cluster of issues you brought up relates to, okay, well, if there was, you know, if there is potential public support for these types of measures, why hasn't anyone exploited this until recently? I mean, and the party politics of it is, you know, as immigration as an unsorted issue is a big part of this. You didn't have clear coalitions in either party, clear majorities in either party, both either at the elite level or at the voter level that supported, because it wasn't a salient enough issue, it hadn't sorted out. Increasingly that has happened, which is actually one grimmer aspect, because it sets up just kind of continuing partisan conflict, perhaps along frozen lines.
Okay, maybe just one more. Edwin.
Thanks for that, Mike. I didn't realise I was interested in Arizona until your talk.
That's why I'm here.
I thought it was a little part of the world, but I've just looked it up and it's bigger than the UK. So my question relates to Arizona as a state. So I'm hearing all this through my knowledge of my limited knowledge of securing borders in US politics. But you know, let me stretch my geographical knowledge of the US. How does Arizona relate in a presumably immigration? There are other borders. There's California, there's New Mexico, there's Texas. How does that play into your discussion?
Immigration became contested at the state level earliest in California, right? And one of the funny things about this whole saga is that was viewed as being very bad in the long run for the California Republicans. Yet the Arizona Republicans did it anyway, right? They're different states with fundamentally different economies and populations, but I did ask that question. So California in the 90s was doing this kind of stuff, and then the partisan politics of the state shifted in a quite decisive direction. What had gone on in the early 2000s was that increasingly Arizona was used as a transit place, right? So there was an increasing immigrant population, but most of the people coming through the border were going to other places in the U.S. And it was increasingly became the main site for irregular cross-border movements into the United States, primarily as a result of federal policy changes in the 90s, where the cities on the borders were, you know, the areas around them were kind of securitized, and so traffic went to the most remote parts of the U.S.-Mexico border that were the most dangerous to cross, and those are largely in Arizona. So, because it's the desert. So that's why and so that is one reason why it became a particular issue in the early 2000s.
Okay, thank you very much. So I'm thinking now that we have maybe half an hour or so for general questions, discussion, and that gives us time to then network a little bit and enjoy the drink. And please do help yourself. If you want to get a top up, please feel free to go down. The university regulations say that any wine not drunk is the property of the head of school. So I urge you to get a top up now, or else it becomes my property. Okay, so I just want to open up the floor. If you have any questions for any of our speakers, or speakers can, interrogate each other and talk to each other. So please, the floor is yours. Yes, Maris.
Yeah.